Welcome. Today we're talking about IVF and other types of fertility treatments for singers particularly, but we also are very lucky to have an opera director with us, Jo. So we'll be getting lots of different viewpoints, different people who've had different treatments, I believe, with different outcomes. So I'm just going to hand straight over to our guests to introduce themselves. I will nominate Alessandro to be our first person.
Okay, hi, I'm Alessandro. I'm a tenor. My wife and I have a 4-month-old daughter called Alessia. Neither of them are actually here at the moment because I've been away from home for a couple of weeks now, and so they've run away to France with Jess's parents. But Jess and I went through several years of before we even attempted any form of fertility treatments, and we had a miscarriage through natural conception and then another miscarriage following what we ended up doing, which was IUI, which is sort of a step down from IVF. It's sort of intrauterine fertilization. It's basically affectionately known as the turkey baster treatment, in that you have to make sure that everything is in the right place at the right time. It became clear over the several years that we were trying that ovulation tests, the home ovulation tests, weren't picking up when Jess was actually ovulating, and so what IUI gives you is the ability to go into the hospital for X number of days when that vague window is open, and every day Jess would have a blood test, and if her LH hormones were deemed to be sort of high enough, then I would be called into the hospital to do my thing, and then everything would sort of happen from there. So it's nowhere near as aggressive or invasive as IVF. IVF was going to be our next step if IUI ended up not working. So with that's what we did. And in the end, as I say, one IUI was successful, and then we lost that baby at 12 weeks. The previous year we'd had a miscarriage at 8 weeks. And then we had, I think, 2 or 3 failed sessions of IUI before it then took again. But by all accounts, we were quite lucky in that. The impression that we were given by the doctor was that we had less of a fertility issue and more of a timing issue. It just so happened that with Jess, everything had to be there at precisely the right moment. There was no kind of, the day before, the day after, you might still be okay. It had to be absolutely kind of down to the minute. So that was why we went down the IUI route.
Great, thank you. I've got lots of questions about that. So
sure.
But first of all, just carrying on introducing our guests. Kristin, I'm going to ask you to speak next, please.
Hi, I'm Kristin. I'm a contralto. I have 2 children, Barnaby and Meredith. Barnaby is IVF. Second round of IVF, first round failed, and even though I was told by everybody that I would never conceive naturally, Meredith is a natural baby. I suffered with an ectopic pregnancy. Literally a month after we decided to start trying for children, got pregnant first time basically. Ectopic, was going to the hospital a lot with pains. They were telling me that they were phantom pains, that there was nothing in my tube, everything was fine, until it was too late. And when they did tell me it was an ectopic, I was kind of like, oh, okay, I just take the pill then, I take the drug. And they were like, oh no, you're going to lose your tube. Then did further tests to discover that my remaining tube was blocked. So didn't have a fertility issue in the sense that I could conceive. It's just that A could never meet B without help. So we went down the IVF route for our son Barnaby.
Thanks, Kristin. And Lottie Bagnall.
Hi, I'm Lottie. I'm a soprano. I have 2 daughters. Heidi is nearly 3 and Izzy is 6 months. And they were conceived via IVF with ICSI, which is intracytoplasmic sperm injection, which is usually a treatment for male factor infertility. So it was my husband with the issue, not me. Although actually we found out later that I did have issues, but not very big ones. So yeah.
Okay, thanks, Lottie. And Jo and Aoife.
Hello, I'm Aoife and I'm a soprano. And we have a daughter, Erin, who just turned 1 last week. And she was conceived through IVF ICSI as well.
Yeah,
and
sorry.
I'm Joe, I'm director, work in opera as well. Yeah, it was second time round, first time failure, and then second time worked.
But it was after, a longer journey than the IVF. I think when you reach that point, you've already been on a bit of a journey. So in total, it was 3 years, I think, for us from beginning to having Erin. So quite lucky, really.
Thank you. Sarah, can you hear me? Sarah's just joining. If you can hear me, Sarah, we're just doing our introduction, so I'm going to ask Zach to do his while you're loading. Go on, Zach.
Hi, I'm Zach Altman. I'm a bass-baritone, and my husband and I have 2-year-old twins that we got using a surrogate and IVF. We had started with one surrogate who we had a bunch of failed implantations and some miscarriages, and we switched to another surrogate, and the whole process took about 3.5 years. Yeah.
Wow. Great, thanks, Zach. Sarah, you've just joined us. We've just got as far as introducing ourselves. So if you don't mind jumping right in, it would be great to slot you in here.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a singer, and I am a mum to a daughter via donor egg IVF. We tried IVF with my own eggs, but unfortunately it didn't work. Well, not unfortunately, I shouldn't say that, because I would not have my amazing daughter if that was the case. So I would not change a thing. But yeah, it took a while and it was a bit stressful, to put it mildly.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. It's great to have such a varied selection of stories here. Completely different journeys from everyone, really. The first thing I'd like to ask, you've sort of covered the early stages and your sort of decision to start treatment. I wondered if I could ask you about what those first steps were, what guidance you were given when you first made the decision that you were going to go ahead with fertility treatment. Maybe I'll ask you first, Lottie.
So for us, it was a case of going to the doctor after a year of trying naturally and being told, come back again in another year and see if you've had any luck, which was a bit of a waste of time. But I mean, she gave us some advice, like take some multivitamins and eat healthily and cut out caffeine, cut out alcohol, which we did. We're still pretty much alcohol free, which is a nice sort of extra bonus. Not so much on the caffeine though. I think that's hard with small kids. And then after that, it was going to the hospital, having more tests, then repeating all those tests 3 months later to see if anything had changed. And then finally we got a referral to the fertility clinic 3 years after we'd started trying. But from then it was very quick. We were referred in August, we started treatment in September. So once things get moving on the NHS, it can be pretty speedy, which is nice. And we were NHS funded. We were incredibly lucky with our first to be NHS funded. So I also didn't mention we were lucky both times, first time. So it can happen. You hear lots of stories about people going through multiple rounds, and that does happen a lot, but you can also be very lucky. So just wanted to put that out there as well.
Is that fairly standard that you have to, they make you wait a certain number of years before they'll...
It depends where you live. It depends how old you are. It depends how long you've been with your partner. It depends whether you smoke. If you smoke, you don't qualify. There's all sorts of criteria. And anybody who's thinking about having IVF, especially if they're trying to get it on the NHS, look up the guidelines for your area, because each CCG is different around the country. If I lived 10 miles south, I would have got 3 rounds on the NHS where I live, I only get one round, and if I lived 10 miles east, I would have got nothing. So it's a real lottery. So yeah.
Right. So is that what you mean when you said you were lucky to get NHS treatment?
Yeah. There's a lot of places that don't offer it at all. So so if you're at the beginning of your journey and you feel like moving house, then that might be a good idea.
Wow.
Move to Camden if you're in London. Don't move to Croydon. There you go.
Is that where you guys are?
We're in Lewisham, and you get one free round here as well, but in Camden you get 3, and in Croydon you get 0. And there's obviously this massive disparity up and down the country where it's just so unfair. And I think after our first failure, I felt I needed to do something. So I wrote to our local CCG and to our local Labour MP as well. And she sent me a really nice, positive response by email, saying that she agrees that it is unfair, but it's just to do with the CCG and what kind of funding they have and where they direct it to where they deem the most need is.
Right.
But I remember one of the stipulations as well was if your partner had already fathered a child or had a child through another relationship, that discounted you as well.
Really, even if it was something to do with your body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So say Joe had had another child with someone else, we wouldn't have qualified for IVF as a couple.
Wow.
But we did, and obviously we used up our NHS round and it didn't work, so then we had to go down the private route, which I think is just so common.
Yeah.
The other thing that's worth noting is if you've already had any private treatment, you then don't qualify so you can't shortcut the wait list by going private and then having NHS later. You have to go, you have to do the waiting.
Is that maybe regional as well? Because I don't think that was the case in Kent. I'm not positive. Yeah, we were going down the NHS route. I had to lose 6 stone to qualify for the NHS route. Lost it all. Got there, and literally they said to me, "Right, that's it. You go for you. Where's your choice to go for the NHS?" And we lived in Whitstable. We said Canterbury, and they said, "Right, fill out this form." Got home and I couldn't wait. So I rang Canterbury and I just was wondering how long the waiting list was for them to tell me that they were closing down the next day. And then the closest place was either going to be Tunbridge Wells or Orpington. So you're talking with good traffic, an hour's drive, with bad traffic, an hour and a half, 2 hours. And everyone on this platform will know about all the scans and injections. So we ended up, with help of our family, going down the private route, of which I wouldn't have needed to lose all the weight that I would have lost. You need to have a BMI in Kent of 29.9, and it can be 36 if you go private. But I spoke to them and they said, look, if you go down the private route, because ours was a time scale thing as well, and it doesn't work, you can still come back and have your go on the NHS. So in our heads, we were kind of like, right, we've got these, we paid for these kind of buy 2, get 1 free on the private, and then we've still got our 2 goes on the NHS. So we, in our heads, to keep positive, we were like, we've got 5 goes at this is kind of what we had. But it might have changed.
That's really nice.
Yeah, it might have changed. This was back in 2017. It might have changed now that if you go private, you can't go back. But it definitely wasn't the case, because I know that was one of the questions that I asked. So I was like, we're jumping the queue by going private, but are we, cutting off our face by losing the NHS options, which they said it definitely wasn't the case.
Okay. Cool.
And for those of you who went straight for IVF, were you offered IUI before that, or that just wasn't an option? But why did you come to be doing that rather than IVF, Alessandro?
I think it was just that we had various blood tests and done, and various tests done that revealed that. So Jess has mild endometriosis, and but she was told that wouldn't necessarily impact her fertility. The tests on me revealed that I didn't have a problem either. And so the doctors basically said to us, look, it's just a question of we think it's just a question of timing here. So let's try. The main reason we tried IUI first is because IVF is particularly unpleasant. And we thought, well, let's give it a try doing the slightly I mean, IUI isn't that pleasant either, because it's still not, it's not a lot of fun, let's put it that way. But it's obviously nowhere near as aggressive as IVF. And so we just thought, we gave ourselves the thing, right, we'll try it, we'll do, a couple of years and then see how we go. So yeah, so that was the main reason, was just that we thought we'd give IUI a try first, but we were pretty imminently going to think about IVF. My understanding from Jess was that we would not have been eligible for any kind of NHS IVF where we are until we had 3 miscarriages. And so, we were only the 1 ticket short before we could get there, which just seemed a very arbitrary, incredibly painful kind of number to set. That's what they said. So,
right. And was the IUI, was that available on the NHS, or did you have to pay?
No, we went privately at the Queen Charlotte in Hammersmith, which is where I was born. So,
is that a similar price to IVF, or is it?
No, I think it's cheaper, considerably cheaper. I think it's about half the price. And what was also slightly frustrating about the process was that we weren't aware the very first time we did it that effectively you can have something like 6 goes, so once a month for 6 months, and only have one consultation meeting with a doctor, for which of course you pay extra. And so we had 1 session, and when it worked and then we had the miscarriage, we then had to pay for another consultation to then have more sessions, at which point they told us, by the way, you can actually have multiple sessions based off the back of that 1 consultation, regardless of whether it's successful or not. And so we then said, oh, okay, well, we'll have 10 sessions then. You end up not paying for all of them if it works before you get to the end. But it seems crazy that you have a consultation in which the doctor tells you something you already know, because you've already, it was only a month ago that you last tried. So it was just a bit bizarre that the communication wasn't great about how exactly things would work. Mm-hmm. But, as it worked in the end. So, actually, technically it didn't work, because in the end, Alessia, it was IUI, but at home, as it were. So we didn't use up all of those sessions that we had booked, but we could have done.
Zach, for you guys, when you guys decided that you wanted to become parents, did you go through a lot of different options before you settled on the route that you took?
No, we didn't. I was very aware of what the options were, which are basically adoption or surrogacy. And so we had decided on surrogacy. Most of my husband was a singer, and he, when he was 30, he decided that he did want kids. It was going to be very expensive. So he went to business school. So this was a long planned process. So that started, I don't remember the date, like 8 years ago, I guess, when he went to business school, because we knew we'd have to pay for it. Now it turns out he's in a job where they do help gay couples with this process, with surrogacy and IVF and things. And I know more and more companies are doing that, but obviously it's pretty rare. So our first step was to figure out how long it would take and how much money it would cost. There were no insurance options. We had to basically hire a person, in Idaho, and the whole process, which luckily we were able to rely on the research of friends of ours who had done it before us. So we copied exactly that process, including who to call and where. There's separate agencies, the fertility agency and then the surrogacy agency, and they work together, but they are separate. So the amount of paperwork, and it was unbelievable. just the amount of time before that process got started.
And I think I remember you telling me that your egg donors were not from the surrogate.
Right. So we went through, the egg donor is through the fertility clinic. We did ours in Utah and Idaho because it's much, much cheaper than doing it on the coasts. And the donor was through the fertility clinic. We basically got a database and we picked some options, and then we sat down with we had a caseworker, and we sat down with her, and she knew what we were looking for and what the donors were like, and she went through the options we'd given her and told us this one is the best. That she matches what you said is important to you. And then the surrogacy agency gave us a list of surrogates, and we had to look through and interview. I think we only ended up interviewing one and chose her, and then she ended up not working out, and then so we chose another one. Yeah.
So how long was that process by the time you arrived at a point where you'd chosen your donor and your surrogate?
The process with the first surrogate was a few years. She had, I think we did 5 implantations with her, and 4 of which ended up in miscarriage, and 1 didn't. So it's actually a really good rate for the IVF. It worked really well. It was the next step of it that was hard. And then we had to leave. We had to find a new surrogate, and that sounds complicated and dicey, but it was not. They are really extraordinary people, surrogates, at least in our experience and our friends' experience. And so then when we went to the next surrogate, it worked immediately. So that's why we have twins, because we were running out of time and money. So just put them all in there, see what happens. And they both took. So she carried them to term. So at that point, that was from the beginning of her cycle or whatever. So I think it was like 10 months, 11 months.
Right. I have loads more questions, but I'm gonna come back to and ask Sarah, how about you? What was your sort of initial stage when you made the decision?
I don't think it's a question of making a decision. It's I was 40. I had so many friends who assured me that they had everyone gets pregnant naturally at 40 these days, and I would be fine. But trying naturally didn't work. So we knew already that the chances were slim. And then I was told, despite living in Camden, that I wasn't eligible for NHS funding because of my own personal, my physical situation. My eggs were not good enough for the NHS to risk it. And even the way they told me, I think they thought I already knew. So the way the doctor just dropped that bombshell, I was going in thinking, yeah, great, got my 3 rounds, and just, no, you're not with your eggs kind of thing. So you'll have to go private. They do that, but we don't. And I can remember crying my eyes out in the corridor, and it was just horrible. But and then when I did go to see a private consultant, I went to see a guy who, it sounds crazy, but who all the Jewish ladies in North London like me at the time go to, and he's the guy, and he gave me a proper down-to-earth talk and said, yeah, your best chance for a baby is going to be donor eggs, but let's give it a try with your eggs and see how you get on. And he laid the cards on the table so that we could, and so I guess, yeah, there was the decision, because we could have maybe jumped straight to donor eggs. I look back and think maybe we should have done. But now it's easy for me to say that. But at the time, we wanted to see if we could get my eggs to give it a go. And although we did conceive an embryo, it never took. And we only ever got 1. And then the second time we got 1. So, yeah, we kind of then, it's like we already knew then, well, that's it now. It's time for donor eggs. And I suppose the decision kind of had already happened.
And then did you go through a similar process to Zach in sort of choosing a donor?
I think similar in the fact that we ended up going to the same clinic as my friend had, because I met up with her. I met her at the fertility support group, but she ended up successfully getting pregnant with donor eggs, and I held her baby. And I was so scared of the whole thing. I just thought, oh my gosh, I'm going wherever you went, I'm going. So I went to exactly the same clinic, and you know, yeah, it worked first time. So I didn't really have, the clinic did it all for us, really. We had to fill in forms describing what we looked like and stuff. I mean, obviously they could see that, but yeah, we didn't sort of have that decision making because they did the whole thing. Yeah.
I think following on from what Sarah just said with the not with your eggs, any advice that I would give to people is that it is a business. When you, whether it's the NHS or whether it's private that you go to, they do kind of drop bombshells at you that is literally just a list that they're giving, and this is your life, this is your everything.
Yeah.
So we were doing a buy two get one free on the private, and they said, oh, by the way, just to let you know that a pregnancy past 20 weeks is a success. And we were like, what do you mean? And they went, oh, well, you're getting buy two, get one free. But if you conceive and you have a baby on your first go, you lose the next 2 goes. And we were like, oh, yeah, fine. But if you actually get a baby to 20 weeks and then that baby dies, that's still a success. And even though you've paid for 3 goes, that's it. It's gone. Mm-hmm. So they see a success. Well, my clinic did, which was the London Women's Clinic in Canterbury, but then all of our process was in Harley Street. Literally, if you get a pregnancy to 20 weeks, that is them. They've done their job. They've got you a baby, and even though you've lost it and you're not holding that baby and you're not a parent, that is still a success in there. So even when you're looking at the statistics, which I'm sure those of us who kind of decided what hospital to go to or which clinic to go to were like, well, what's the success rate of this one? And that's what I was doing for weeks. You then find out that statistic is actually how many pregnancies they've got to 20 weeks. And if it's 20 weeks, it's a success rate. And that for me was the brutality of it. It was literally just said to me, well, yeah, but we've done our job. That's your body failing is what they were kind of making out, that they've done everything right. So I think when I've got friends who have gone through IVF and various scenarios with IVF or blastocyst or anything like that, I have literally said, as nice as they are and as lovely as they are, it is a business, and you at some point you will feel like a number, and that just made me think of that with Sarah, not with your eggs. It was kind of like that with us when they just said, oh yeah, no, that'll be it, you'd be done.
Yeah, it was awful. Sorry, I was jumping in. I think I'd advise anyone in that situation to ask the clinic, what are your live birth rates? And I think if it's in this country, it's regulated. They have to provide that data, so you get a bit more of a realistic picture. It's such a horrible term, but yeah.
That's really shocking. I've never heard that. And I get the impression from a friend of mine who's going through it at the moment that you really are read out a list of statistics that are designed to prepare you for disappointment, it sounds like.
Yeah. Especially if it's age and all these different things. Well, because of your age, this, and then sorry to jump in there, Joe, but when you're going through all of these tests, the very last test that they did for me was the AMH test. So even though you've gone through everything, and in my case, you've lost weight and you've taken all the blood tests and your husband's done his test and you've done all the rest of this, they say, right, yeah, you can go for your IVF. Oh, but by the way, the most important test is this AMH test. And if that is below a certain number, then no. So you're kind of like, you're at that last stage, and it's like, yep, going for IVF. Oh no, I've got to wait for this result now. We ended up going private. This is when we were still going down the NHS, but we ended up going private for the AMH test because it comes back in literally 24 hours. Whereas the NHS, I think it was about 2 weeks, something like that. And I was like, well, we've come this far and we've done all of these things. I want to know now that my eggs are okay, not in 2 weeks' time. So yeah, there's I think it's just hurdle after hurdle with it, basically.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that actually as well. It's a sort of curious mixture as you go through it of all these success rates and all of these sort of things, that the bullshit that you have to get through in order to work out which place you're going to go to, and then a series of sort of disappointments or things that you hadn't been made aware of, or things that mean that you're down to 16% success rate or 2% success rate if you go through this and go through that. So actually when we were choosing, because we did our NHS cycle pretty quickly, and then we went private for the second one. As we were doing that, we sort of tried to look for the most value for money. So we looked at clinics in Greece. Mm-hmm. We looked at clinics in, where was it?
The Czech
Hungary,
Czech
Republic,
Spain, but Spain
was expensive.
Pricey.
But we looked in various different places, and the difficulty with that, I'm trying to remember. One of you guys must know that there's a website here that has all of the success rates and live birth rates here, and it's a sort of standardization. I can't quite remember the website.
HFEA, Human Fertility
there you are.
Embryology Association, something like that.
That's it. That's it. Yeah. Really useful for UK, but of course, then we were going to Greece, and there we go, all sorts of different other statistics, and so it's the process, along with the sort of upsets and disappointments and all of the things that you go through, being told each thing in sequence never comes out at the start. It's always sort of you get further down the line, and then you've got another test, and then there's another thing. So yeah.
We actually decided in the end to stay in the UK because it was mid-pandemic and borders were closing, and it was just too much of an unknown to try to commit to being abroad and get the possibility of getting stuck somewhere. But
friends of ours did go to Greece, and
that's true.
Been looking at
and have been
it's
so would you have to live in that country for a long period of time for the whole duration of the treatment?
No, there was, I think you had to be there for a certain amount of time. I can't quite remember the details now. It's something like 2 weeks before you take your treatment.
Yeah.
You do the tests, and then, all being well, it's quite a sort of tourist market. We've forgotten it now because we never actually went through it, but they're geared for people, coming and doing it from abroad. So they do it very quickly, short bursts. You come for a weekend, they do it. Then you come for the longer period to take the drugs, and then at the end of that period, you hopefully sort of it really, and you can then get tested. Some of the clinics had testing places in UK as well. London Women's Clinic had a thing with a couple of Greek places. So it's mind-bogglingly complicated once you get into the international bit as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The next thing I wanted to ask was, once you started treatments, how was that in terms of juggling that alongside work? Obviously for the women, how did you feel physically going through all the hormone treatment, and how did that affect your work? But also for the guys, emotionally and sort of in terms of tiredness and the commitment, the time commitment, how did you juggle it alongside work? Maybe Lottie, I'll ask you first.
I gave up most of my work to have IVF, which is probably not what anyone wants to hear, but I thought, if this is going to be my shot at becoming a mum, I want to know that I did everything. And actually it got to the point where I started treatment, and the first part of my treatment was going on the contraceptive pill. Bizarrely, that's how they start a lot of people off. They put you on the pill, and basically put you into early menopause. And I felt absolutely fine with that. So I rang up the guy who was doing the recording contract that I wanted to do and said, "Have you still got room for me?" And he said, "Yes, come in." So I did that, which was really nice. But I decked out most of my concert work to a friend for about 4 months, just to give myself some time. I'd been kind of frightened into it by a fertility nurse who'd said, if you carry on being this stressed, it's not going to work. And that's the worst advice. Everybody says don't get stressed. It's impossible not to get stressed. But I don't know if I would do that any differently now. I think I probably would still take a lot of the time off. I didn't want to be traveling. I didn't want to risk getting stuck somewhere. And actually for my second round of IVF, I turned down a tour to Israel because I didn't want to risk being stuck out there and miss my embryo transfer. So I think I carried on teaching because that was just up the road, and I did 1 or 2 concerts that were up the road. And actually the hormonal stuff was fine because I was on very low doses. I was 31 when we started treatment. No, I can't remember. It's the early 30s, which is quite young for IVF. And so they put me on mini doses of everything. But after egg collection was when I felt really rough. I had mild ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which is where your ovaries basically swell up to the size of, well, it felt like melons. It was horrendous. And I think if I'd been trying to sing, you know, something even remotely challenging, that would have been hard. But it went away pretty quickly. I think I was back to normal within a month and a half. But then we went into lockdown. So it's really hard for me to say what I would have carried on doing and not doing, because it was a really weird time. But yeah, I think the egg collection was the worst thing for me. I think a lot of people would probably say that it's not fun, but it's also over quite quickly. So that's something in its favour for sure. And you can ask to go under general anaesthetic if you're somebody who's really not good with pain, but that has its own repercussions. You've got a longer recovery and so on. So I'd say definitely think about the work you're doing around that time. You can usually plan quite well around it. The clinics are quite good at, if you want to avoid a specific month, then you can. I think they can even get it so you can avoid a specific week. So if you've got a contract you really want to do, I think most places can work around it. But I don't know. I didn't ask. I just went, yes, tell me what to do and I'll do it. So, yeah.
How about you, Alessandro? Were you, in those early stages, were you working?
Yeah, I was. I think obviously the thing with IUI is that it is still very much cycle dependent. So there are a couple of days, 2-3 days in a month when you just have to be able to literally drop everything and run into the hospital. Now, obviously for Jess, who I always say she has a real job, that was okay for her, and her company were amazing and were very, very supportive. In my instance, we did end up missing, I think, at least 2 months because I just couldn't get out of the work because it was literally a day's notice. And for 1 month I was abroad, so that definitely didn't work. And there would have been the option of trying to freeze things, but then you start getting really exorbitantly expensive. And, you know, I think we hadn't quite yet reached that level of desperation. I mean, Jess was 36. So again, you know, not old, but not young either. So also there was parental pressure, blah, blah, blah. But I think the toughest part was literally, I might get a call at any point over that sort of 3-4 day period and like, right, you have to come into the hospital right now. And so you would have to schedule things in. And, you know, if that's the route you're going down, you're going to struggle because it's not as though you've got an idea of approximately when it's going to be in a month. But obviously our work is all sometimes in the diary for a year ahead, 2 years ahead. And it's not that you're going through each month and counting 28 days, like, right, okay, in February 2023, this is when Jess is likely to be ovulating. So it really was just a question of, sorry, we can't do it this month because Alessandra's away, you know, and it was incredibly frustrating. But you know, you just have to make it work. I mean, the clinic is flexible in the sense that you say, right, we can't come in this month, and then you don't pay for it. But in the back of your mind, obviously, you know, if this doesn't work, we then have to start IVF, and so you're applying pressure to yourself. I think emotionally, the big thing, which I suspect most people would agree with, is that it is difficult in the beginning to remove the romance from, because in these instances, obviously, there's very little romance involved in this whole process, and so it becomes quite a functional event trying to have a child, which of course, you know, we grow up, you know, it's the ultimate form of love between two people and so on and so forth. And then you're just sort of sitting there in a hospital room, you know, and it with a plastic cup, and you sort of think, this isn't really how I envisage this happening. So I think for me, as the male in the process, because I wasn't having to undergo all the horrible stuff that Jess was having to undergo, it was that emotional side as well of thinking you just have to sort of separate the love for the person and that incredibly functional let's just get this done, because once the child is here, you're not going to care how it was conceived. It's all about a healthy child at the end of it. So yeah, the timing was just what it was. You can all sort of predict that, I suppose, but the emotional side of things was slightly tricky as well.
Can I just jump in a second? And I've realised I haven't talked about my second round of IVF for my second daughter. She was a frozen embryo, so she was actually conceived at the same time as her sister. And for that, my husband could have got away with not coming to anything, because all the injections were for me. He didn't have to be there to see her get put back in. I mean, he was there. He was great. He was very supportive. But he could have gone off and done other things. So I think it really depends on the kind of treatment as to how available certainly the man has to be. But and also for same-sex female couples, you have a sperm donor. That is sort of taken out of the equation as well. So yeah, there's definitely different experiences out there for how involved the man has to be in terms of physical presence. That's not to say it wasn't a big emotional deal for him, because it was, but he didn't technically have to be there.
Right. No, that's useful to know in terms of having to drop everything and be there at the top of the hat for people who are working in this industry. How about you, Sarah? How did you feel in those early stages in terms of
in these sort of early stages of the own egg cycles? Partly I took a more full-on kind of basically the only proper job I've had. It was still in performing arts. It was running lots of big singing projects for children, when there's lots of kids in a big venue all singing together, and kind of running all that stuff and having a salary. First time, the only time in my life I've ever had that, because I needed to pay for the IVF. We needed to pay for it all. And so in a way that was great, because I had a really supportive HR team and a really supportive manager, and they were making sure I could take time off when I needed it to get the treatment done. But actually having to cope with doing the injections, I mean, got a whole list of various venues around London that I've injected myself. I'm sure all the women have in the interval somewhere, or in someone's dressing room or whatever. But I knew that it made me feel really rough. The hormones are making me feel awful and bloating me up, so that people would say, "Oh, are you expecting a baby?" It's just like, oh God, the last thing you want to hear at that point. And so it was different when I then was doing the donor egg cycle, because you do still have to take hormones, and I did still have to do some injecting. The donor was doing all of the main stuff, but I still had to you have to make sure that your body does not ovulate, because that would not be good, because the wrong egg might, it just complicates it. But so I had a big project coming up that I knew would be stressful, and I told the clinic that I didn't want to do it until after a certain date. And because we were using a donor, that was possible. And I look back now and think, wow, because of that annoying project I had, I now have this daughter. It would have been a totally different egg if just by delaying by 1 month. And we did ours in Spain. So we went to Spain in April. My husband gave his sperm there, and then they tested it and froze it. So that stayed in the freezer till August. Then we flew back over and had the embryo transfer. So it was a fresh egg, but frozen sperm. I mean, the science crazy, isn't it? But yeah. And then it worked. So we had 2 little mini breaks in Spain. Didn't tell our friends why we were there, but yeah. But making it still was a stressful experience to have. And yeah, I think if I'd have been freelance, it just would have been really difficult to do all of that.
Jo and Aoife, were you both working around that period?
For the first round that we did on the NHS, I was actually working for the NHS as a vaccinator, and the shifts were 12.5 hours long, very, very repetitive work on your feet all the time. So I emailed the nurse in charge and just said confidentially, this is what's happening, and I'd really appreciate if I could do shorter shifts. And they were very accommodating and never asked, what the outcome was or anything. And then the second round, work at that stage, this was summer 2021, and a last minute contract came in, or offer came in from WNO And we thought, well, this contract pays for another round. And one thing that I discovered was that continuity of care is really important. If you can try and stay in the one place, it counts for a lot. So we decided to try to get a cycle done in Cardiff to coincide with the work there. And in hindsight, it was a pie in the sky idea, but time pressure when I was in my late 30s, kind of mid to late 30s, and every month that goes by, you feel more and more desperate, and you just want to get on it as soon as possible. And we got to Cardiff and everything was set up, and I was on I think a kind of medium protocol. So I was injecting in advance, and I went for my first scan, which coincided, I think, with the first day of rehearsals. And the nurse said, "Oh, Aoife," and there was a problem and they couldn't do the IVF that month. And they said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll just do it next month." And I said, no, I can't. Like, I'm a singer. The embryo transfer could clash with the opening night of the opera that we were doing. And I just said, I can't commit to that, because I couldn't let my colleagues down. So I ended up getting a refund from that clinic. And one of the good things was that Welsh National Opera knew about the situation. My agent had told them, and it kept me out of the picture, so I didn't have to get involved. I didn't have to feel emotional having that kind of very private conversation in a work situation. But I knew that I had their support. No one said anything at work, and I think it was kept very, contained within the rehearsal room. And then a few months later, I was working for a different opera company. We decided to go back to the NHS hospital that we had our first cycle with, and they also offer a private service. And again, the next opera company were aware of the situation and aware that I would have to just dash off to scans and appointments, and I find it a really good distraction being in rehearsals. I know it may not be the same for everyone, but I kind of thrived being busy and not having to just focus on this one big thing. And both companies, WNO and Neville Holt, were fantastic, I have to say. It was just, they didn't say anything, but I just knew that I had their support. And at the end, like, I was injecting, doing rehearsals and performances, and it has to be so carefully timed, as many of you'll know. And I remember running off stage after the sextet of Don Giovanni in the second act, and like doing a costume change backstage, and then having my drugs preset there. Some of them had to be in the fridge, and some of them, it was just, and then feeling like a total junkie, and then going on to sing Mi Tradi. And I don't know, I mean, and then they said that the hospital said, we're going to wait until your performances are over before we do the transfer, because you're just too busy, you're traveling a lot, you're saying, so it was the best advice. And then it did happen. And some friends who had been through IVF said, what are you going to do during the 2-week wait, which is the period after which you find out if it's been successful or not. And it's a very tough time, as you'll know, because you just drive yourself mad with every little physical feeling. You go, oh, am I pregnant? Is this, and someone said, oh, what are you doing during the 2-week wait? And I said, oh, we're going to go off in our camper van. We're going to go up to Scotland. And she looked at me and said, really? How comfortable is your camper van? I was like, well, the bed's like this wide, so it's not exactly luxurious. And she said, don't do it. Like, do everything you can to be rested. And so we went and got a cottage in West Wales, did loads of hiking, totally tried to, unplug from the stress of it all. And and it worked. So for me with the drugs, circling back to physical effects, I was very lucky, didn't have anything. It was more the mental load.
Yeah.
And I think the mental effects of going through IVF are underestimated, and I think that there should be more talking therapy that's on offer, because, you know, I'm lucky to have a very supportive husband, and we shared a lot and we talked a lot, but it's tough, you know, it is a tough process.
You didn't feel that the hormones had any physical effect on your voice or your breathing apparatus or your...
No, in my case, and it's probably very personal, I didn't feel any different. And I remember asking my singing teacher before that summer, before these contracts were coming up, and I said, do you know, because she's, you know, in her late 70s and she's taught for decades, and her daughter's a very well-known singer as well, and her husband, and I just said, do you have any experience? Do you know of any other singers who've been through IVF and have been singing alongside it? And she asked around and she didn't know anyone. And I thought, well, I'm just going to give it a go. But the most important thing to me always was prioritizing the IVF and not the work.
Right.
Because in our case, it felt like time was running out. And
useful thing to mention as well with that is that you were on very high doses as well, so it's not about the doses and how it affects, you know, according to effect. It's just down to how the body reacts.
I was on the maximum dosage of Gonal-F and all sorts of stuff, and it didn't affect me, luckily. So
no. Joe, I'm going to come back to ask you about your experience in that time, but I just wanted to ask Kristin if you had any physical reaction in terms of singing.
No, not at all. I didn't feel as though it affected me at all, and I went from quite a medium protocol first time around when it didn't really work, and I was understimulated, so I didn't produce enough eggs. We still got one go. Still had the 2-week wait, which didn't take, so then went to the maximum protocol, or what I thought, and then even then kind of like the last week of taking the medication, they even upped my Gonal-F even more. I can't remember the dose, but it was something ridiculous, like 475 3 times a day, something like that. And I still didn't get hyperstimulation or anything like that. So I think my constitution is quite strong. I think I need a lot of dosage to affect me. But no, at no time. Saying that, I've had friends go through it sopranos who felt as though they lost their top notes. I'm a contralto, so I haven't got them anyway. So I did feel as though everything got richer and I could get lower than what I got beforehand, because, you know, you do kind of do crazy things in the 2-week wait, and I was kind of just sat at the keyboard and singing, I can go lower than normal. Didn't feel like that affected me. It was definitely the emotional side of things that affected me more so than anything like that. I didn't give up work for the first round. I was in a contract, and when it didn't work, I think I blamed that contract. So did give up work. I made everything second time round very, very different. First time round, I told my whole family. So I told friends were phoning me, how are you feeling? How are you coping? How are you doing it? And then I realised that when it didn't work, that I was going to have to phone those friends, phone that family member and tell everyone. And therefore it was everyone's loss. So second time round, we told nobody, literally no one knew. And my family were kind of like, when's the second round going to happen? And I was like, I've got to wait for my cycle to restart, and it hasn't started yet, and which was all just lies. That was a lot less stressful, not talking. It was just me and my husband talking about it. And I can remember going to a Take That concert because I'm a bit of a fan. And in the car park on the way out, I had to inject, and my sister was in the car next to us. We parked, and I'd forgotten, and she's kind of looking at me, and I'm looking down, and I was like, hi, and just, you know, thankfully she didn't clock on or anything like that, but I literally was injecting the car park of the O2. So no, I don't think the drugs affected me, but the physical side of things, the mental side of things, definitely affected things, and I think would have affected performances as well for me. But I had a time scale. I was 36, but my dad was dying of cancer, and my dream was for him to meet any baby of mine, which then became my dream, was being able to tell him that I was pregnant before he died. And he died when I was 8 weeks pregnant with Barnaby. So I got to tell him, and things were different for me. If they'd have said to me, you're not going to have this cycle, you're going to have to wait, that would have been the end of the world, and it would have been the case of being able to tell him or not. So I think everyone's journey is very, very different, and with age on your side, like with Lottie, it might have been that you'd have been able to say, oh well, I'll do this contract for 6 months and then I'll start IVF again. That just wasn't the case for me. It had to be then, it had to be now, and that kind of kept me focused. And maybe that was the reason why the drugs didn't affect me emotionally, hormonally. My husband might disagree with that, but I think I was quite sane. I was quite sane about it all, and vocally it was fine. But there is an emotional pressure on everything.
I remember reading an article about the emotional side effects, and about this woman who had tried to hit her husband across the face with a toaster. So we were like, should we put the toaster away?
I'd had a friend who told me who'd just gone through IVF, and she said, oh, it's horrible. It is the worst thing. I cried after every single, and I don't for a second believe that that's not true. She cried after every single injection. She said it was incredibly painful. She said that she was emotional, that she was screaming, that she couldn't sleep. She was having hot flushes, all of these things happening. So it is down to the individual, definitely. And she got her baby out of it, but thank God it worked first time round, because she even says that she's not sure she would have done it a second time round. She found it that horrendous.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, Jo, for you, it sounds like you probably weren't working during your first round, if that was mid-lockdown. But
but I think actually both rounds I wasn't working. Is that right? I happened not to be working, so it was I had no advice for people who trying to juggle it, and also it's a bit easier for directors. I would more or less only be in rehearsals, so as long as you're not on stage, then it's easier. So
I was about to say, I imagine that would be harder, because at least we know that there will be times when we're not being used for
but you get to make your own schedules, though. You see, you don't have to explain it. No, it would be difficult, but to a certain extent, as long as you're with the right company, you can just say, I'm not available at this point. I was lucky I wasn't.
And would that have needed to be short notice for you on IVF? Would you have had to say to them, I've got to go now, or this morning at 11 o'clock I will leave, or it wouldn't have been so short notice?
No, because it was ICSI, it was all sort of a bit more planned. So you have a bit of a schedule, a bit of a time. So there I can't quite remember. There's some you go for various tests, so you wouldn't have to drop everything immediately. You'd know with, what is it, 3 days notice or something like that?
There were a couple of scans that were maybe 48 hours notice, and generally they're pretty early in the day, so you can try and make it work unless you've got a big distance to travel to get to rehearsal.
But it's not the same as IUI where it's reliant on the natural cycle, because they the drugs mean that they regulate the cycle, so they're sort of able to plan it a little.
So they can delay it and then start it at a time that suits
your
schedule.
And so, Zach, I guess same for you then. It sounds like you wouldn't have needed to had to drop things at short notice.
No, in fact, all of our contributions were frozen, and then they did the embryos. So and then COVID happened, so we actually weren't able to go out at all, which is in its way a kind of privilege and also really surreal and odd to not be physically part of most of the process. Yeah, everything was frozen.
Right. So if it hadn't been for COVID, how would it have been different?
We would have met our surrogate before the week she gave birth. We would have been out there more actively part of the process. We missed all the doctor's appointments. We zoomed in, we missed all of that because we couldn't go out. And also, in the States, the Idaho and Utah are pretty, they were pretty dangerous places to be at the time. So we were really
as a gay couple.
Yeah, I thought that would be terrible. And it was not at all. We were in Boise, which is in Idaho, which is surrounded by, a real city surrounded by the rest of the state. And then in Utah, we had no bad experiences, which I was really pleasantly surprised by. And it's kind of an industry there, this stuff. So even though most couples that go there aren't gay, they do exist. It's not that weird. That's changing now, of course, because of the right to choose and abortion, things like that. So the industry there will suffer. But for a while, it was like this little haven where a lot of people understood what we were doing.
Yeah. So I guess you probably weren't singing at that time then, if it was in the middle of COVID.
Yeah, I was singing for the first few years of the process, which was fine. It's a weird IVF, and all of that is uncomfortable for a lot of people to talk about anyway. And then for us being gay, and people wanted to know things but were uncomfortable asking, a lot of assumptions, things like that. But I mean, compared to the kind of pain, physical and emotional, most couples in this process go through, it was okay.
Did you have a lot of contact with your surrogate, sort of Zoom contact?
Yeah, we did. She was always available to us. She, our first surrogate as well, but the surrogate who ended up working out, she was always available to us. She had been through the process before. We were the third family she had helped. She'd even done twins before. She had done a gay couple before. So she, as much as anyone else, guided us along the process. And she's a nurse's assistant. So all of it, even when we were out there, she was explaining the scans as the doctor was explaining it. I mean, she was a miracle for us, really. Mm-hmm. And the first one too. We still are in contact with both of them. I was just back in Idaho singing, of all places, and we got to see her again. She got to see the kids, older than a few days, and it was really, really nice.
Yeah. Relationship-wise was one of the things I wanted to ask. This might be another personal question. Did this process put a strain on your relationships? How did you cope as a couple? Maybe since you're here as a couple, I'll ask you, Joe and Aoife.
Terrible. Hated each other. No, we were having a chat about this earlier, and I think for us, we were lucky. It was an intense process. One of the things sort of mentioned is that actually IVF in a sense is the midpoint of the process. So you've already gone through quite a lot anyway. Couples who are heterosexual couples who are trying to conceive naturally. So for us, there had already been. I remember the first time we started trying, and we were saying, "Well, we've got a good contract in 6 months' time, so maybe we'll try in 3 months' time, and then maybe we'll get this date right. And if we do it on the 17th, then we'll have a baby on X, Y, Z." So so then it goes down the process much, and you go through an emotional journey then anyway. But it's it's intense. It's just really intense, and you go through different points of sort of needing to pick each other up and going through the same low points at the same time. And I know we'll come on to talk about who you tell and what you tell to people, and that's it was a constant live thing. I think the point at which we possibly the least sort of the closest to an argument was the idea of telling people or not telling people, and I was very adamant that I wanted to tell as few people as possible. It's difficult. It's a really difficult one to do, but but essentially you only you share the journey together, and you're the only people who can really understand it together.
Yeah, but I felt like I needed the support of some close friends, and Joe was of the opinion that he wanted to tell maybe just his sister, and that was it. And I struggled with that because I just needed the input of others, yeah, but it was difficult. I think one other aspect, I think your physical relationship changes quite a lot when you're on this path, because somehow, you know, anything that's intimate feels transactional, and then of course when you get through those first stages of finding out that it's not happening naturally for whatever reason, that's still quite a long period of time, and then it becomes really clinical, which I think Alessandro touched on, and so that was another aspect that that I think changed us as a couple, at least at that time, but it also did bring us closer, I think, because, you know, you're sharing something so intimate, and, you know, you're getting results for sperm and egg, and, you know, it doesn't really get much deeper than that. And it certainly, I think, made us stronger. Of course, we prefer not to have had to go through this journey, but it is worth it whenever, you know, it is successful. Anything else to add?
Anybody else want to come in on that question specifically about your relationship? Sarah, you've got something.
I think it made us stronger, but my husband had lost his mum during the time as well, so that there was a lot of other stresses, and I think we just kind of clung on to each other in this storm, really. But when you mentioned about talking to friends, I found that even friends, well-meaningly, but would often say things that were really upsetting and triggering, and the old classic of, oh, just relax and it'll happen, you know. It's that kind of thing, you know, really can be just the last straw sometimes with what you're going through, and that's why it's not for everyone, but that's why I ended up going to a fertility support group, and I made some great friends through it, some of whom I'm still friends with now, and because they really got it. And my friends, the ones who got pregnant at 40 just by winking at their husband, they didn't get it. So yeah, that helped me. And I guess it also helped our relationship. But my husband didn't have that from his friends. He felt like he couldn't talk about it at all to his male friends. But obviously people do try. Sometimes it is best not to talk to people who haven't been through it, because they just might say stuff that will really make you feel crap. And they don't mean to.
Yeah, this is going to be one of my later questions, but since it's come up, I think it's really, really important thing. I'd love to have your advice, all of you, on how as a colleague or a friend or a family member you can be supportive, what not to say, what to say. I'm going through it myself at the moment with a friend, my very close friend, who's going through IVF, and I'm blundering, I'm making blunders and feeling that I'm pushing her away, and it would be great to hear from you how best to support somebody that's going through this.
My friend went through it, and I sent her a little parcel. Obviously I'd been through it, so anything that I was sending she was kind of seeing as a positive thing, but IVF babies are known as unicorn babies. I don't know if anyone else knows that, but they're known as, and I knew that from a Facebook support group. I joined a group trying to conceive through IVF, then pregnant with IVF, and then had to leave that group and go back. It was, but found out that so you've got rainbow babies and unicorn babies. So I wore unicorn socks to my egg collection. Also bought pineapple juice and
I did that.
full fat milk. And was it Brazil nuts or walnut?
Brazil nuts.
Yeah. All of these things.
McDonald's chips.
McDonald's fries.
McDonald's all of these things. So literally gave her a list of the, what would you call it, the superstitions, and so gave her that pair of socks and things like that, and I think making it fun is something important. When we were going through IVF, I treated myself to getting my nails done. And went through the rainbow because this was going to be our rainbow baby as well as our IVF. So that was something that I was doing for me. And so little things like that. And when it sounds ridiculous now that I think about it, but when we were going to have our embryo put back in, I had rainbow nails on and rainbow on my toenails as well as the socks. And I don't know that worked, but it was a positivity, and it was something that I needed. I needed that focus, and I don't know whether it was to do with my dad's illness as well. But everything in our house was a rainbow, and my husband, if he was working and saw a rainbow, well, that's it. If there was a photograph of a unicorn, he'd snapshot, and he'd send that back to me. So I think any of the superstitions and anything that she might not have heard of, that whether it's Brazil nuts or have full fat milk in the 2-week wait or have pineapple juice or anything like that, I think that's the thing that I would have wanted, friends to do for me.
Mm-hmm.
Keep it light.
Yeah.
Yes, I've heard from my friend that she doesn't want me to be emotionally involved in this and feel that it's her loss is my loss, and that I'm with her so supportively that if it doesn't work, then she's exhausted by feeling that, which you mentioned earlier, Kristin, of having to tell people, and for them to be upset by that, it's too much for you to take on that as on top of everything.
Yeah, that's why I think that we literally did not tell a soul. I think the only person who knew for our second round, and it did feel like more like our round. The first round felt like everybody's round. Second time round, my husband and I would talk about it afterwards. It did feel like our journey, just the two of us. So that when you do take the romance out of something, it was getting messages. Oh, where are you? And we're just out for coffee. We were at the clinic. It felt kind of naughty in a sense, lying to people, but it did bring us together. It did make it feel like it was more about us. Whether if it had worked the first time round, it still would have been wonderful, still would have been magical, but because it didn't, and because we had to tell everybody, because I had to explain to everyone that it hadn't worked, and then people say, well, why are you going to have a meeting with the IVF clinic? Why didn't it work? You've given all this money, why? And then the IVF clinic offer you counselling, and it was all just a bit too much, and I was just like, I don't want to talk to anyone, definitely don't want to talk to a counsellor, I just need to focus on the next round. This is done, this is over. I can't even have time to think about whether that was a loss or a miscarriage or what it was. I just need to move forward, and that helped with us, making us continue to feel close throughout the process.
Yeah,
I think the thing. Sorry, go.
No, go on. Go ahead.
No. I would just say. I mean, to follow on from that, I think that the thing that would piss me off the most would be if and actually I have to say this mainly came from parents rather than necessarily from friends or colleagues or whatever, but it was precisely that, is that something would, you know, if it didn't work or whatever, and they would then try to present you with solutions, like potential solutions, or try to appear interested by asking you lots of questions about it, when all you really want is, oh, that's pretty shit, hope it works better next time, good luck, if you need anything let me know. And then you just talk about other things, like you don't need to pussyfoot around it, but also it's not helpful. Like anything that they might suggest in terms of, you know, are you going to get counselling, are you going to get more help, are you going to get it? We've already discussed that with the medical professionals by that point, that you're not going to tell us anything that they haven't already suggested. And just having more people saying that that's what you should do. But it's the same with everything. Like when something doesn't go right on stage, or when something doesn't go right in whatever you're doing, the last thing you want is for someone to say, oh, have you thought about doing that? It's like, piss off, I don't care. You know, that's not what I want. I just want you to tell me that it was really shit, and that's it. I mean, we can move on.
With that, sorry to jump in, no. There's a real temptation with IVF and infertility to blame yourself. So we had this a bit with our relationship. My husband was the one with the issue, and it was really hard because he wanted to fix it and there wasn't anything we could do. And having other people say, have you tried this? Have you tried this? It's kind of them saying, you're not doing it right. You're not trying hard enough. You know, this is it's your fault you're not a parent. And I know that's not what people are saying, but this is how it feels on the receiving end of it. And I also think when people are asking for updates all the time, a lot of people don't realise not a lot happens when you're having fertility treatment. There's a lot of waiting around. There's weeks and weeks between scans, and you know, the only thing that you do every day is inject yourself or take a pill or whatever. So we are very prickly when we're going through it. I look back at some of the things I said and I'm like, it's really bitchy, but but I don't think I'd be any different if I was doing it now. So yeah. Sorry to interrupt, Alessandro, but
no.
Yeah.
One thing I was just remembering as well when we were talking about whether we tell people or don't tell people. So I was saying, you know, that it sort of feels for us like you have a number of things stolen from you, you know, when you're going through this process, you know, that you're not allowed to go through the natural, inverted commas, process. And again, for heterosexual couples, you go through the process of the natural conception, and part of the thing about not telling people was that I didn't want that moment to be stolen from us as well. The moment when you tell friends that you're pregnant, and it's not, you know, it's a
unexpected
announcement, yeah, that comes as one usually would, you know. I felt that I don't know whether that was just me, but it felt as though I wanted to control that in some way.
Yeah, I can imagine when we were going through the second round, deciding whether to tell people, I think my husband said, well, if we were doing this naturally, we wouldn't phone your mother and tell her that we're going to the bedroom. So, you know, so maybe let's just give it a go and keep it just between us, and you know, that worked for us.
The reason we didn't find out the gender when we were pregnant was because we'd had all the other surprises taken away. So the surprise it still was a surprise to get pregnant, but it wasn't as much of a surprise as if it had been, you know, a rowdy weekend in Mauritius, you know. It's
What about you, Zach? Any blunders or insensitive comments?
For sure. It's inevitable. And like the period when we were having a series of miscarriages, it was tough, and whether to tell people things like that. There was also the being removed from it, which is a blessing, but then really difficult, and then being removed from each other because of my job. All of that was hard, but people kind of know how to handle miscarriage. There's like a shared language around it, but they didn't know how to handle ours, you know. And I found it uncomfortable to have to guide them through it. Like, you can just say, I'm sorry, and we move on. You know, you don't have to then follow up with a list of questions about what happens next and what it means to us. In general, I would say that our children aren't the place for politics. So the question of surrogacy and like bodily autonomy and misogyny and things like that are valid, but they're not for me. That's for your own stuff, because without it, we wouldn't have our kids. It's complicated. And also, your opinions about adoption are unwelcome in this circumstance. Of course, we understand it may or may not have been an option for us. Like it's more complicated because we're gay, but even if we weren't, it's really nobody's business why you would want to have a biological child. The question people always want to ask is, because they're twins, are they yours? Are your husband's? Are they, genetically? And I would say, in general, it's much more comfortable to just be asked than to watch you try to figure out a way to ask. But I try to be really generous, because this isn't a situation people come across very often. So I try to be calm. I bristle a lot. And it happens, I don't want to be xenophobic, but in German-speaking jobs, that people feel comfortable asking questions about the politics of the situation and whether they approve or not of the way we did it. Like, your approval is not necessary and not welcome.
Wow, that's shocking.
I like your thing about just saying just ask, or just because the thing is, the whole point of this thing this evening is for people who maybe aren't going through it to also view it and learn something about it. And so ultimately the big issue that we found is ignorance, is that there is still very little ever spoken about, even by medical professionals, about kind of what might happen or what might not happen and what you might end up going through and all that kind of stuff. And so it's similarly, whilst there are times when you just want to smack someone in the face, at the end of the day, the reason they're asking these questions, or the reason they're saying these insensitive things, is because we haven't had enough of these sort of events that can explain to people that maybe. So we also similarly can't just sort of always jump down someone's throat because they happen to ask or say one insensitive thing. Like, there is no, people aren't ever. This is just not part of our education at all. And I came into this completely with zero idea of what fertility problems might be like, or what. I had literally zero clue. And so I was learning as we were going along as well. I was in complete shock at how difficult everything was, and how, also because I know I bored Kitty with this in rehearsals in the last few weeks. I'm convinced that GPs in this country automatically tell every single woman that she's going to struggle to conceive, because I don't know anybody that hasn't been told that they're going to struggle to conceive, because they cover their backs that way, don't they? Because it means that if you do struggle to conceive, well, you were warned. And if you don't struggle to conceive, miracle baby, well done you, how fantastic you are. And you can then go around telling everyone that you winked at your husband and you got pregnant, which is then also the one thing that is very annoying for someone who's going through fertility treatment to hear. So the point is that by having that kind of, what I feel is like this umbrella thing of everyone's going to struggle, they don't actually go into detail. They don't actually teach you anything. And so you come into it, certainly from the male perspective, I had zero idea of what we were getting ourselves into when we decided, 6 years before we conceived, we started trying. And I had zero clue that what was going to happen. And so that's precisely what these sorts of events are really important for, to have people talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. When you do conceive, is there a point in the pregnancy that you arrive at where you cease to think of yourself as an IVF pregnancy and a miracle, and you can just relax and
no,
doing lots of shaking?
We had scans every week.
We
had scans every week for 35 weeks.
Yeah, we paid for private scans. We did everything, because it felt like such a wonderful, incredible event. It either felt like it was going to be taken away from us, or that something was going to go wrong, because everything had gone wrong with the step of, for us, an ectopic pregnancy, and then IVF not working, and then getting pregnant, and then losing my dad. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to make this sound like an episode of EastEnders, but it was so many that we thought everything was going to go wrong, yeah, we mentioned at every single scan that it was an IVF baby, and then IVF babies are probably you're going to have a big baby with an IVF baby, especially if you've had blastocyst. It'll be a big baby. It'll be this. It'll be that. Oh, IVF babies normally go over. Oh, IVF babies are normally early, and no one's got any clue, because actually, I think it is just a normal pregnancy. I gave birth 36 weeks and 1 day, so my son was a month early. My daughter conceived naturally 36 weeks and 2 days. So, you know, it was just me and my body. There was the size is pretty similar. So that's an IVF baby and a natural baby. But yeah, no, I think it feels like an IVF baby. Even now, he's my IVF baby, even now.
For me, I think my second pregnancy was less stressful than my first pregnancy, just because I was already a mum and I'd done this before. I was still stressed out that it was going to go wrong. I think also after both of my babies were born by C-section. The first was not a planned C-section. So I had this whole thing of, I can't conceive naturally, I can't give birth naturally. And I was fine with all of that until I couldn't breastfeed naturally. And I did eventually get there with breastfeeding, but I remember having a complete meltdown when my first was 3 days old, going, I can't do any of this. I'm not meant to be a mum. I'm not even supposed to have this baby. And I think this obsession with natural, especially as soon as you're pregnant and people start saying, oh, you know, you should have a water birth, you should have a home birth, you should give birth in a ditch in the forest because it's better for the baby. You know, people are just so obsessed with this natural thing. And, you know, there's a reason that doctors are there. There's a reason fertility treatment exists, and it's not a failing on anyone's part to have it, I think. But I was like Kristin, every scan, oh, it's an IVF baby. And the nurses and the photographers, they love hearing that, because, you know, it's a nice story for them. So, yeah.
I think for us, it actually felt more like it's always in the back of your mind that it was IVF, but I guess we had a distraction in that I had hyperemesis gravidarium throughout the pregnancy, which is people don't know, the really, really intense sickness. And I think that was kind of more of a concern because, you know, I lost 5 kilos at the start of the pregnancy, and it was just, I was worried about medication that they were prescribing and if that would be harmful for the baby. So it was more about the health of the baby rather than how the process got us to that point. And I think we didn't go for extra scans. I had a private scan in Dublin once, the 20-week scan, because I happened to be there for work, and everything else was just scheduled.
I think we, particularly after 12 weeks, we just sort of just got on with it. You were in bed for most of the time. But yeah, I suppose it became a different thing because of the illness with it. But
were you hospitalised with that, Aoife? Sorry,
almost. They wanted me to come in at 13 weeks because I was vomiting blood at that point. But there was a huge COVID surge, and I just wouldn't go in. I kind of weighed the risks, and I thought if the doctor said you need to restart such and such a medication, and if your next meal doesn't stay down, you have to come in. And I was like, so I was lucky, you know, that I didn't ever need to be hospitalized because of it, but I probably should have been, certainly in the first and some of the second trimester. But she seems fine. So.
Good. Were any of you singing throughout the pregnancy, and did you feel, you know, sort of worried about that, concerned about working rather than just staying and resting and keeping still?
I sang with my second pregnancy. I didn't with my first, but that was partly lockdown and partly just not really wanting to be traveling. But I managed to pick up quite a lot of local work in my second pregnancy, so I did sing then. You just worry about everything with an IVF pregnancy, I think. You know, oh, I stepped on a twig, it's going to do something. And it sounds completely stupid, but yeah, I think, well, there's a lot of natural pregnancies where people worry about that too. But yeah, I think because I'd done it before, I felt more confident singing second time round. So yeah.
I turned down a contract at Wexford. It might have been because of my dad, but of losing him. But I think also it was because that was going to be 11 weeks away, and my husband's self-employed. So when I'd done Wexford before, he could get across once. I kind of felt as though he'd been taken away from the process a lot, because everyone asks about the woman. No one really ever asks about the man, how he's feeling emotionally. It's always about her because we're taking the drugs and things like that. He's kind of pushed aside. And I kind of thought, if I get the first kick, or if I get, and I'm an island, and he's missing out on that as well. So I ended up turning down that contract, and I've got regrets, you know, but then ultimately I think, like Lottie said, if I had my time again, I'd probably do that same thing again. But I still worked. I did a lot of teaching work, and thankfully I've got quite a few cathedrals and churches around, so I still sang oratorios and did a lot of that, but I didn't do any opera work whilst I was pregnant with my first.
Right. How about you, Zach? Did you sort of schedule around the due date? I guess like anybody does with pregnancy.
We tried. The first few implantation stuff we were around my schedule, and then we just stopped. And then the pregnancy that actually took and was during COVID, which worked out, you know, grossly well. And then for the next basically year, I was mostly home, which was, you know, really nice. Unfortunate for the rest of the world, but it worked out.
Yeah, but some of you have already answered this, but my question is, if you decided to have more children, would you do it again? Would you go through IVF again? Was it worth it, I guess, which I'm sure everybody will have the same answer.
I've already done it again. The second time was a frozen transfer, as I think I mentioned, so a lot less invasive. I wouldn't do another fresh round. I've got my two little girls. We haven't ruled out having another one, but it would be another frozen transfer, and then if we get to the end of the road with that, we wouldn't do it again. But we've got two already, so it's that, you know, we're so lucky, and you know, we don't need to do it again. So, yeah.
So your choice to not go through another fresh round, is that because the extraction process was the work?
And also because I'm now older. I had an incredibly high AMH level, which meant I was a sort of perfect candidate for IVF. Lots of eggs, lots of good quality eggs. That wouldn't be the case now, 4 years on. So just the success rates would be a lot lower. And it's a lot to put your body through, and taking time out of work and things. I feel like I've done that once. I've made that sacrifice. I don't want to do that again, especially now I've got two already. I have to think about the impact on them as well as the rest of it. So yeah,
I think if we'd have gone NHS first time round, we'd have paid for private to have a sibling, but because we paid, and you know, I think it was upwards of, just for the information for anyone watching this, it was upwards of £14,000, because we paid for that to get my son. We had resigned to the fact that we were only ever going to have one child, because we kind of thought, you know, to go through and pay another £10,000, well, that could be us taking him to Disney World, and it might not work. So it's money that we're taking away from the one child. And when we were going through IVF, we were like, we just want one. We just want one. You know, when we're not going to be one of these couples that once we get one, that we want a second. And then it just happens that we're one of these couples that fell pregnant naturally. And honestly, even now, I've no idea why, because they still believe that my remaining tube is blocked. So I don't know how it happened, but it did. But no, if we financially, nothing to do with the stress or the emotion, the injections, anything like that. Financially, if we hadn't have fallen naturally, we would not have gone through IVF for the second time round.
Mm-hmm. We're similar in that we will not go for another fresh round. I think the first time we were so optimistic and we thought, this is it, it's going to be great. You know, we've finally got assistance, it's going to work out. Crash. It was devastating. Second time, so lucky it worked out. And we were lucky enough, we do have a frozen embryo. We don't know what the future holds for that. And that's, you know, another conversation. But we certainly wouldn't do another fresh round for financial reasons, as you just mentioned. And putting your body through all of that and the emotional impact that it has, and just what you said, Lottie, about having a child already, it kind of feels like you'd be tempting fate, and, you know, having to, if it didn't work out, to then have to come to terms with that and how that, and actually, you know, if I were to have another pregnancy and I was as sick with the hyperemesis, how that would affect Erin. But yeah, certainly not another fresh.
Yeah, I've got to say we had no frozen, so we had, you know, we had one shot at getting Barnaby, and that was it. And interestingly, we did have 2 eggs. Barnaby was a BB, 2BB. So there's loads of grades that you can find out about the embryos. Hence the reason why we called him Barnaby, double B. And the second egg that we had was a lower grade. And we were wanting to go back in. But there were studies that said that the lower grade one will pull the higher grade egg down, not the other way round. So we just put one back, and in the hope to freeze the remaining egg, and it didn't survive the 9th. So that's why we said that we would only ever have one child, because we would have had to have gone through the whole process again, absolutely everything all over again, and the costs would have been exactly the same, if not more.
I think it's worth noting as well that all of our experiences are success stories, and there's an awful lot. I mean, there's so many discussion boards of people going through IVF countless times. And we know an awful lot of people who've gone through that and been unsuccessful, and that's a really, really difficult process. That you know, just because it's worked once doesn't mean it will work again, and that's an even more difficult emotional struggle that we thankfully, you know, never had to go through, but we'd have to consider that were we to go through another process again.
Sarah, you looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think we did have frozen embryos, and we had planned that we would try and see if we could go back over to Spain and give one of those a go for a sibling. But the date that we planned to do that was March 2020, and we all know what happened then. And I do know some people who continued to have treatment. The clinics were open, you know, after a few months, and we talked it through and we decided we just didn't want to do that with everything that was going on, and it just felt really intense. And so through that kind of made the decision for us about not trying for a sibling, and now we're kind of really happy with our one and done kind of little family, and I'm really sort of happy that we both are. But it feels like the whole world thinks we should have another. You're not allowed to have any more child. What you know. But then if you've got 3, why did you have 3? You know what it's like. Whatever decision you've made is not good enough for other people, and you know. So I'm constantly battling against that, and just have to think, well, this is our family, and this works for us. So, you know. But I don't know what would have happened if it hadn't been a pandemic.
We did think about the financial side an awful lot when we were thinking about having the second child, you know, thinking we could spend all this money that we could put towards Heidi's education, future, whatever. And in the end, we decided to spend the money and try for a sibling, and we were lucky. But it could have been very different, or we could have made a different decision. And I think we just have to let families do what they need to do, especially when their method of getting there is so complicated and expensive.
But I think what Sarah was saying about people's opinions, it's just mind-boggling. I mean, you talk about IVF and it's like, oh, who's got the problem? You're like, oh, for God's sake. And then when I got pregnant naturally with my daughter, I don't know if it was my in-laws that said this or my husband's got a really annoying auntie, it could have been her. But it was one of those things, oh, do you just think that maybe if you'd have just waited and you wouldn't have had to have gone through IVF? And we're like, and my Rob's that, and my husband, I'm the fiery one, he'll step back and he's like, no. Barnaby paved the way for Meredith. There would be no Meredith without Barnaby, because they do say that, you know, giving birth can flush things out and things like that. But that's also something that's a romance for people who want to conceive naturally second time. We never thought that would happen. Never for a second did we think that would happen. We just didn't. It just happens to it. But just the insensitivity of people saying things, you know, if you'd have just waited, you know, you wouldn't have had to waste all that money. And you're like, oh God, the thought of paying out more money now and taking that away from Barnaby is something that we would never do, but it was never a waste, you know, to try and bring a child, never a waste. And you borrow, beg and steal to do it, you know, and it's people that you know have, like Sarah said, got pregnant when their husband winks at them, that don't understand that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Alessandro, I imagine it's a little bit early for you guys to even be thinking about having more, because you're only 4 months in, aren't you? But
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in our case we come from two very, very different families. So I'm an only child. Jess is one of 3. My parents had me when they were both in their early 40s, and Jess's mum had already had 2 kids by the time she was 21, I think. So you've got sort of completely polar opposites. And also on the one hand, you've got my I'm going to say my parents, but it's only one of the 2 of my parents that basically I've had my entire life with her saying, kids are the worst thing that you can possibly ever do to yourself, and they will ruin your career, and everything is shit after you've had kids. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Jess's family that have been saying, I mean, I personally, because I've lived with that for 30 years, I kind of forgive it. But I find the other end of the spectrum is just as bad, of your life isn't complete until you have children. You can't possibly be a proper human being until you have had children. And, you know, what are you doing with your life? The only point of adults on this world is to create children. And so those are the 2 things. So we sort of met in the middle. For me, it's purely because IUI was not as expensive as IVF. In theory, we could go through it again. If we saved up again, it wouldn't be quite as massive a financial burden as IVF would be. But I personally, and this is a conversation Jess and I will have to have, I couldn't go through all that again. Or more to the point, I couldn't see if we had exactly the same outcome again. So, you know, 3 years beginning to end of starting the IUI, 2 miscarriages, Jess nearly dying from blood loss, then after the second miscarriage, then Jess nearly, you know, losing a huge amount of blood at birth. Why would you ever want to go through that again? I don't, as a male who doesn't, you know, I can't possibly understand why anybody would put themselves through that multiple times. And so as for me, from an emotional perspective, there's absolutely, I can't see myself ever wanting to go through that again. Whether Jess does or not, we'll have to see, and whether she manages to convince me. I mean, she convinced me to have 1, so she may convince me to have a second. But yeah, I just, it was just too awful a period. I mean, and we're among the incredibly lucky ones that have ended up with a healthy child. You know, you can spend years and years and years going through this with all this pressure coming from the family and friends and all that kind of stuff, and then, as it were, have nothing to show for it. And you know, I couldn't go through that again. It would then detract also from I think Alessia's childhood, and I just don't think it's something I could ever go through again. And I'm not even the one that bore the child. So yeah. maybe that's quite selfish of me, but I mean, ultimately, if Jess wants it, that's what we'll do. But but you know, from my perspective, I just don't think it's something that we should go through again.
I think that's very understandable, given what you've been through. How about you, Zach? Is it something that you guys would go through again?
No, we had two, so we were incredibly lucky. It's a boy and a girl. So, one thing I did want to address with everyone else is the financials. It's at least 6 figures to beginning to end. It's more with twins. It's more with an experienced surrogate. The numbers start really piling up. And what I would say to any prospective parents, at least in the States, is that assuming adoption is cheaper leads you down a path that probably doesn't have the results that you are looking for. It can be, it also isn't necessarily. But to have a child the way we did is just incredibly expensive and incredibly time consuming. So we cannot. But because we're very lucky, we don't have to.
Yeah. And I can imagine also, not wanting to put words in your mouth, but in terms of the distance also in that instance, it adds a whole other level of stress and anxiety as well, because, you know, with us, we can talk to our partner, we can say, how are you feeling? Are you feeling any different? You know, we can but for you, I can't even begin to imagine the levels of anxiety that you must have been going through at not knowing from one day to the next how things were.
It was very difficult, especially given our first few pregnancies and how they had ended. It was very stressful because of COVID. We couldn't, as I said, we couldn't get there. She got COVID at some point very early in that process, where we still didn't know what that meant for pregnant women. And then we were on our way out. We went out 2 weeks. She had a planned cesarean. We went out 2 weeks before that. And on the plane right there, we were at a connection. She was texting us that she was having contractions. She didn't know if they were false contractions. It was deeply anxiety producing. And, we have the buffer of it not being our bodies, but also, like you said, the not knowing, not really understanding what was happening it was really odd. It was just a really, really weird way to have children, but we're incredibly grateful for it.
Did you set out to have twins, or is that something that sort of happened?
We knew by that point in the process, we were pretty aware of all the statistics of all the things we were trying, and we knew going into that there was a 65% chance of both embryos taking. And then our caseworker also told us, given the rest of our numbers, it was probably much higher than that. So we knew it was a very strong possibility that there would be twins. And we'd always wanted two. So our plan was to do one and then the other. So when they both took, we were just incredibly relieved.
And you said it was more expensive to have twins. What's the...
It's more expensive to have twins. Each implantation costs money, so putting them in costs money. The surrogate, if you are paying someone, so if it's not someone that you know, she gets more money for having twins, but not as much as having two. Like someone said earlier, it's a business, and fair enough. She's entitled to more than that. But it was,
With Joe and Aoife, would that have been the case if you had chosen not to freeze one of yours, but to have them all implanted at once? Would you have paid for each implantation?
Yes. Would we?
I don't think so. If we were to have it all both at once, do you mean? Yeah.
No.
Yes,
but they decided because of the grading, the frozen embryo was of a lower grade. Mm-hmm. It was borderline whether it would even freeze. So yeah, I
think that the latest guidelines are to discourage
multiple transfers.
Now that changes when you go abroad.
Yeah.
They gave me
that's again different in different parts. I've got a friend who's 41, and they basically said that the older that she is, the more they would put back in, because the risk of not none of them taking is higher. Therefore, if you put 3 back, you might be able to get 1. And that was Leeds. So I don't know. That was this year though. So or maybe last year. So yeah, I think it's all different. But I know with my clinic, there was no matter how many I wanted back or anything like that, no different cost to it. But there is cost for blastocyst, and which is basically where they take the embryo till the point where I'm going to sound really thick here, but to the point where it's almost about to blast into a baby, but isn't quite, is how I have it in my head. But that costs more as well. I think that was an extra 500 to have blastocyst. ICSI was an extra 1,500. But we were told to have ICSI, even though there wasn't a male issue on our side. My husband's count was absolutely fine. I don't know why. Maybe they just wanted more money, of which we gave it to them. But yeah, there was not a male factor with us. But we did ICSI both times round anyway. But yeah,
that's. Oh, sorry.
Do they keep the embryos in a test tube, or in their kind of possession for longer rather than implanting them earlier on?
Yeah, it's you can have a 1-day transfer, 2-day, 3-day, 4-day, 5-day. The blastocyst is predominantly a 5-day transfer, and then someone else will have to explain from there. Although my husband could tell you word for word, he was the one that was reading up on everything, and I was just the one doing everything. But I think it's almost like, even though it's a 5-day embryo that's going back in, it's older than that. Is that what it is? It becomes like
I think you might be talking about assisted hatching, where they encourage the embryo to hatch out of its original shell, which it normally does after implantation, but sometimes they encourage it along a little bit faster.
Yeah, it might be something,
but it sounds something like that.
It might be assisted hatching. Blastocyst might be the same thing. I know that because we got a photograph of Barnaby, and it was like a circle, and then literally like a big bubble about to explode.
That's a hatching embryo. That's really cool. I got a picture of both of mine going in. So there are magical moments in the process as well. I put it in both their baby books and written, this is the first time we saw you, and all of this. So there's a lot of cool stuff that goes on. Yeah.
I actually saw our daughter as that on the screen in front of me before. We didn't know it was her yet, but she was a hatching blastocyst. Yeah. And then after the transfer, I said, and when do we get the picture, the printout? And they said, oh, no, that was a live video feed. You can't have that. She's in. And so I wish so much I'd asked before, but I just assumed that we'd get a picture because I knew everyone that. But anyway, who wants to see themselves as a bunch of cells?
I'm going to wrap this up because I've had 2 hours of your time. Thank you so much. This has been so interesting and really, really educational. My last question, really, which is, you've already offered so much advice, really invaluable advice, but if there's anything else that you thought of in the run up to this that you would offer to anybody who's thinking about going through any of these things, I'd be so grateful if you could just throw them in these last 5 minutes before we wrap up.
Watch comedy videos, because it is scientifically proven to help laughter after embryo transfer. So yeah,
I think just know it's your journey, and that other people will have so much advice for you, and don't think that if your journey is any different to theirs, that means it's going to fail, or that means it's not got anything to do with anyone else. It's just your journey. And the only serious conversation that my husband and I had throughout the whole of it, because we, like Lottie's just said, we made everything funny, we made everything a joke, but I did have to ask him after the first round failed whether I was enough, because I was the issue. whether whether I would be enough for him, if this never happened. And he said we'd just get 1 million cats and stink of piss and lavender, and that was great. And I think that is a conversation to have, to make sure that the relationship is going to survive, because I do have friends who have gone through IVF and the stress of it has caused a rift, and they've not got back together after it. Is to maybe ask those questions of your partner before going through the process.
Someone touched upon the fact that the male side of things maybe isn't as visible.
Yeah,
I know that Jo, you went on forums and you were like the lone wolf in these sea of women, writing advice, and it was so helpful. But I think it's hard for the guys not to feel that there's a sense of supportive community out there. So that would be a tip that I think we would offer, is that if you're a heterosexual couple and you're the male side, then make sure your voice is heard if you need that support and you need that advice.
I would also say go with your gut, and take as much information as you think that you can get. There's quite a lot out there that you can go down a hell of a lot of rabbit holes, and all these support groups are good up to a point, but go with your gut and take care of each other.
Yeah. Very Jerry Springer there at the end.
I wanted to say just quickly, if there's anyone listening and watching who is going to probably go down the donor conception route, to please look into all the fantastic support that's out there for that specific journey. I hate the word, but it's used a lot here, because it is a very different scenario. There are a lot of implications for the child and when they become an adult and so on, when they're donor conceived. And there's the Donor Conception Network, there's Path to Parent Hub, say that clearly. There's all sorts of support out there, and it's really important to have counselling as well, because you have to think about the implications for the child you're conceiving in donor conception. It's not just IVF and then move on.
Piggybacking off of what Sarah said, the politics and understanding around donors is changing really quickly, and the public perception of it. And so I can't anticipate what it will be for my children by the time they're old enough to understand. But it can be upsetting, but to do a really deep dive, including of people that regret it and people that are upset about being the child of a donor, it feels like they're in the minority, but it's still worth investigating what that would feel like for you if that ended up being your circumstance. We spent a lot of time doing that, and I'm really glad that we did, and I kind of wish we had done more. I'd also say for people in our situation, 2 men wanting a child is really, really different than 2 women, and much more difficult of a process. And it would have been next to impossible for us if we had not stolen the research of other people who had stolen it from someone else. And starting the process is incredibly daunting. And I would encourage anyone to reach out to anyone that has done it before. At least I can't speak for everyone, but in our experience, people that have done what we've done are eager to share what we've learned, because there's so much time and energy, including myself. It brings me a lot of joy to guide other people, to help them with the kind of research that we've done, and the organizations and the people, and you need lawyers, it's pretty endless. And if anyone's watching, especially in the States, we know some about Europe, but not much. But anyone in the States, please feel free to reach out to me directly, or I guess anyone else who has done it.
That's generous. Thank you. Cheers. Right, I'm going to let you all go. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. As we were saying early on, just before we started recording, it's a subject that isn't talked about a lot. And I do think this will be incredibly valuable, and I hope people will watch it who are not necessarily thinking about going on this journey, but trying to support other people who are going through it. There's so much really, really valuable information in this. So thank you again for your time, and congratulations on your lovely little ones, your miracle unicorn babies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kitty.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Lovely
Kitty.
to meet you all.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.